All right, it's about 4 past the hour, and I'm sure lots of people are going to join us. I am full of hope, and the evening is young. But I wanted to go ahead and introduce myself. Um, my name is April, pronouns are she, her. I live in Dallas, Texas. I am a member of North Texas AfroSoc, and I am also a member of the National Political Education Committee. The National Political Education Committee is who is hosting this wonderful event. Just a little bit about NPEC. The National Political Education Committee both hosts national events like this one, and we also provide local political education through trading, peer mentoring, and then also educational materials. So if you're doing political education work in your DSA chapter and you'd like to get in touch or get some sort of support, please contact us at politicaleducation@dsausa.org. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So, a little bit of context about this particular event. It started out with some comrades on NPEC thinking about the colored people's history of DSA, and this article that was written by a couple of comrades that we'll actually have on this call today. And we take a step back in history that's kind of personal to me, actually, not because I was actually there when the two organizations, National American Movement and the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, like came together to form DSA. In fact, I think I was a handful of days old when the first convention happened, October 14th, 1983. I was born on October 3rd of 83. But in 82, these two organizations merged together. And the reason why they did so, even though they were two kind of different organizations, they did so in order to like combat this like unique conservative threat that was coming from the right, and that threat was Reagan. And those austerity politics were going to end up like affecting a lot of my childhood, actually, even though it was just being born at the time that this organization came about in order to like combat a lot of these terrible things that were going to happen in the future. And so they came together, and it ended up being a very white organization in 1983. And then some things were done by people of color in that organization, which we'll talk about soon, in order to combat that. And some very well-meaning white people in order to create an environment where organizing could take place by all people in a collective effort to stop Reagan, to stop this terrible political mindset that was hell-bent on eradicating a lot of people. And so 37 years later, which I know because I'm also very old and 37, I'm in this very same organization. And so less than a year ago, I left my chapter and became an at-large member of DSA. And I'm personally searching for ways in which to change this organization so that people of color are able to organize in a safe space, and so that we can stop people of color from leaving our organization. And when I say people of color, I also mean myself. I'm trying to find a safe space for myself. So this has been a very personal journey. And it's very important to me, though I love having the privilege of playing Oprah, being able to ask the tough questions, and, you know, without all the resources or the ethical problems of being a billionaire or the cool hair. like, how do I actually fix this organization, and what problems still exist from then, and what makes this organization totally different than it was 37 years ago, and how do we move forward? I think these are really important questions to ask. And with all that in mind, I'd like to introduce our panelists and then get to the actual history of the organization. So a quick intro of everybody who's here today to talk to us about this history and moving forward. So first of all, we have, let's see, hold on one second. Let me introduce our panelists. We have Kevin Richardson. He is one of the authors of number 31, resolution number 31. He's also a member of the National Political Committee, a member of North Carolina Triangle DSA. He's a member of the National Abolition Working Group and the Growth and Development Committee. We also have Mikiko James. She is an author of Resolution 31. Mikiko currently serves on the National Political Committee. She's on the National Abolition Working Group and the Growth and Development Committee. In her home chapter of DSA LA, she coordinates the Black Liberation Task Force. We also have Jorge Maldonado. He is an author of number 27, resolution number 27. He's also a member of North New Jersey Trading Subcommittee of the Growth and Development Committee. He's active in field work electorally. We also have Jordan present with us. He is an author of number 27, resolution number 27. Jordan is currently serving on the National Growth and Development Committee. And he also chairs the recruitment subcommittee. He's a former co-chair of New Orleans DSA, and he's a coordinator of the local mobilizers working group. Let's see, and we also have Alyssa De La Rosa, and we've got David. Alyssa is the former co-chair of Sacramento local and a member of the AfroSoc caucus, and she's also one of the authors of a Colored People's History of DSA, and David is also one of those authors as well. That's a mouthful, and then I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to present some of the history of DSA so far from 1982 until the present. Alyssa, take it away.
Hi there, everyone. So thank you for the introduction. So my name is Alyssa De La Rosa. I'm joined here with David Roddy. We are the co-authors of the People's Colored History of DSA. So I think one of the things that we wanted to start off with before kind of going into more of the historical facts were really just to talk about our personal motivations for why we decided to write the series. And so for me, at the time of writing this series or really starting to conceptualize it, I was an active member of my local. I was one of the co-chairs of Sacramento DSA. And I think one of the things that we've, really intentionally tried to do as a local is really engage with our communities who are a majority people of color. And, one of the frustrating things to kind of run up in our organizing with this is the history and the reputation of DSA itself, right? And I think for those of us who identify as people of color, it can be very challenging to not only overcome this stereotype, but to kind of move past it in very concrete ways. And so part of my frustration and just hearing about this stereotype all the time that DSA is really white. I mean, one, it's true, right? We're always trying to recruit more members of color. But I also felt like as a person of color was very damaging, right? To hear this stereotype and to feel like the contributions of people of color were diminished in that way, in that stereotype. So not only did it discourage people from joining, but it also had a negative impact on people who had already joined. And so I think really what we were trying to do was to, in a productive way, move past that stereotype by really showcasing and highlighting the contributions that people of color have played in this organization, and not just recently, but really since its inception. And I think what you see in the series, if you all have read it, is that from the very beginning, this question of how to make this organization multiracial has been at the center of really its formation. And so those are my personal motivations to get really started. And it was really awesome at the beginning talking to people like Max Elbaum, people like Bill Fletcher Jr. to really encourage us to look to the past so that we could move forward. David?
So when I first joined DSA, I think it was around 2009, I went to my first convention, and it was mostly white people over the age of 65, and I didn't really think anything of it. And then I was invited to go as part of a youth group to a convention of the Committees of Correspondence, CCDS, for Democracy and Socialism, which was a split from the Communist Party. And everybody's still really old, but there's like a lot of older Black people there. And it kind of made me think, like, why is there this split between these two organizations that might have kind of divergent histories, but have similar politics? Like, what drove this demographic change? And so at the time, I figured that it probably had to do with the fact that organizations that might be rooted in what we would call like Marxist-Leninist ideology could have something within their organizational histories and their bylaws that kind of put the idea of self-determination of what they would deem like national minorities in the center. And so when I started this project, it really was inspired by this piece that came out in the New Republic that was talking about, well, how DSA was so white, and the conclusion was that it's white because there's too many Marxists. And that was 100. I mean, I just knew, like, that's like probably the worst explanation you could give. And so I happened to be lucky being in Sacramento. The first person who I met in DSA, who might have been the only active member of DSA at that time in the late 2000s, was this man, Dwayne Campbell. And Dwayne Campbell ran the Anti-Racism Commission, and his wife, Dolores Delgado Campbell, was very influential in the Hispanic, what they called at the time, the Hispanic Commission. And so
Of DSOC.
Well, first of DSOC and then of DSA.
Right.
And so he had this giant stack of the commission's like bi-monthly newsletter. And so I kind of had like a unique opportunity to learn like what this history actually was. And going back to CCDS, I actually found so Max Elbaum used to write this series Crossroads, and it was supposed to be like a inner left like journal from the that was active in the early 90s. And he wrote a piece on the convention of the Communist Party and also the conventions of DSA, both in 1991. And during that time in the Communist Party, there was something called, there's a network called the Committees of Correspondence, and they formed this thing called the Initiative. And part of it was, after the downfall of the Soviet Union, was rethinking the organizational strategy of the organization. But another big part of it is that a lot of the Black members of the Communist Party felt that the party was sliding back in terms of its commitment to racial justice. And at the same convention, at the same year, DSA had a convention, and I think there's a bit worth reading here from Max Elbaum. He says, DSA is not just predominantly white, it is overwhelmingly so. The problem is longstanding, directly related to the organization's failure to insist that anti-racism be placed at the center of its outlook and its activities. At this convention, less than a handful of delegates were activists of color. Except for prominent invited speakers who are present only for their speeches and a few other persistent activists, the vantage point of communities of color is generally absent from the group's deliberations. And this was 1991, and 20 years later, I observed the exact same phenomenon in DSA before its growth. And so we knew that there's this longstanding thing. And I also knew, for example, that Manning Marable, who was on very prominent, prolific writer on African American studies and like Pan-African struggle, and he was an early member of DSA coming out of the New American Movement, and he even had a series of papers that he wrote. It was supposed to be an annual newsletter called Third World Socialists that kind of outlined a socialist vision that incorporated what at the time was called like the Third World, people who had been either formerly enslaved or colonized that represented oppressed minorities in America, and also were at the time reaching various stages of independence from the, being colonial subjects. And there was a period where at least several hundred activists of color engaged directly in DSA work right at its inception that built the commission system. And the commission system, you have to understand, people were very concerned about self-determination coming out of the 70s. And so you had like a Latino commission, or Hispanic commission as they called it. You had an Afro-American commission, there was an Asian and Pacific Islander commission, and there's a Native American commission. And so all these commissions were supposed to work on issues directly related to people's own identities.
And I think it's interesting to say, so this vantage point that's given by Max in 1991 is really different, I think, from the description of the very first convention in 1983, where you do have a really like vibrant and strong showing of minorities, in the sense that we had just come off of creating these commissions, and at this point the commissions had already met a couple times prior to this convention to kind of organize together and to get on the same page about some of the demands that they were going to make at the convention. And so even this vantage point in 1991 is really different from what we hear about in the very first convention. I think it's important to note that, you know, that there is kind of a ebb and flow to kind of this participation, and deciphering what events kind of led to those ebbs and flows is important as well.
And so the presidential, was it 84? The Jesse Jackson versus Reagan. And so the Black left, certainly, and many people coming out of the 60s left and the New Communist movement in the 70s really supported Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition because it kind of presented this anti-austerity, anti-military buildup, pro-international platform. And DSA was at the time, and perhaps still is to some extent, like heavily influenced by the sort of mainstream trade union movement. And Michael Harrington himself really wanted to build a coalition that included what we would now call like mass liberal organizations like the NAACP into a wing of the Democratic Party that could then exert influence. And so the main liberal left supported Walter Mondale, and the commissions were the commissions were really in favor of electing Jackson. And after Jackson and after DSA failed to endorse Jackson, essentially a lot of the people who had kind of
were really initially drawn to DSA because of the potential to engage with the Black left did end up leaving.
Yes.
And I think it's a pivotal moment that you can see the repercussions even in 1991, for instance.
And I mean, part of the repercussion is that there weren't really any elders within the organization that weren't white. By and large, the people who you're going to see at conventions were not people who had been previously engaged in Black liberation struggles, immigration struggles, international solidarity work with Central America, which was big in the 80s. And so it has a lasting sort of scar in the history of the organization that's been nearly impossible to overcome.
And I think that brings us to kind of looking at how the history overlaps with these resolutions that we're about to talk about. I think one of the themes that we see throughout the series, at least initially in the 1980s, is really the theme of representation, especially at that very first convention. So one of the major demands was to basically have the NPC be representative of the folks that were attending. So having a quota of 6 non-white folks on the NPC was one of the first demands that the minority commissions put forth. And speaking to people who were present at that convention, so for instance, Dolores, said that it was a very contentious battle. And I think, that theme of representation still really overlaps with some of resolution, for instance, 31, where it's looking at representation within the multiracial organizing committee. And I think there's also, some similarities as well, in the sense that I think having this concrete ask of collecting demographic information, that's something that I think also draws back to this idea of representation. How can we say these things if, as an organization, we don't even keep track of that, right? So I think that these resolutions do speak to that overall theme that I think is continually present throughout DSA's history. What's your theme for the resolution?
Oh.
Integration.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important to, how much time do I have?
I say give it 1 or 2 minutes to talk about integration.
Okay, so, well, in the 1990s, for example, in Sacramento, the Latino Commission had organized to oppose several bills, one of which was going after multilingual education, one of which was going after undocumented workers having access to healthcare. And this is all coming off of the sort of shock of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and working on these very specific issues that related on one hand to international monetary policy, and on the other hand to the racial backlash that defined politics from the 70s up until the 90s, allowed for particularly Latino folks like the Al Rojas, who was recently deceased, and Eric Vega, who both were members of the NPC for a time, to become incorporated in the organization. And so I don't think it's just a matter of representation. It's also a matter of being to articulate struggles that affect people's lives into a vision of socialism.
And really integrating that into the work that we do on a daily basis as an organization. And I think that, I believe Resolution 27 does that as well, where it really centers and requires that we do engage and integrate these struggles into the organization itself. And I think that draws really heavily from the history that we've seen in DSA, and really the push for centralizing those struggles to the organization itself. And so hopefully that's a nice segue into the resolutions.
All right. Thank you very much for that setup. Very, very much. So with that in mind, I have a question for the authors, and any author can take this one, because our historians did a really, really good job of setting up the framework of what has happened in the past of DSA. I'd really like for somebody to give us a little bit of a framing of what has happened in the past couple of years historically with DSA. Like, can you lead us up and what's really happening with DSA to this point, as far as, I guess, a colored people's perspective of history is concerned, like what's happening with BIPOC, just from one of our authors. Who would like to take that? One of our resolutional authors, actually. Y'all are off the hook. Not everyone at once, please. Who's got me? So let me try one more
Sorry,
time.
I couldn't jump on. Sorry, I was.
Oh.
Sorry about that. Leaving you hanging is like resolution authors disappear.
I was running. Thank you.
So yeah, maybe I can say a little bit, at least from my perspective. I think we've seen, let me just do my video, it's a little blurry. So I think we've seen in part other instances of these kind of identity-centered commissions. I think the Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus is an example of that. And that's something that's been instituted rather recently. So I think that's in the spirit of the Latino Commission and African American Commission that, you know, Alyssa and David both describe. I think one of the things that for resolution number 31, I think one difference there is that we are, you know, we think that it's really tough, right, to be one of those kind of commissions and then be tasked with, you know, making the organization this multiracial organization. When you're at a Latino commission or African American commission or even Afro-Socialist and Social of Color caucus, you know, it's at once this identity-centered caucus, but then, you know, you're expected to take up this task that it seems like, you know, we believe the entire organization should take up this task. So I think that's one of the things looking at the history, you know, that kind of resonated with us, but then thinking, okay, are there ways we can create different kinds of commissions or committees that don't put all of the pressure of saving the organization or diversifying the organization or making the kind of multiracial organization we need, not putting all of that pressure, right, onto, you know, people representing different identities and caucuses. So I think that's one thing we see in the past, and one thing that for these resolutions we're trying to avoid for various reasons that we'll get into a little bit later.
All right, well, that's a good idea. Let's get into it. So let's start with resolution 27. Let's get a summary from one of the authors of 27. Just give us a rundown and let us know what the inspiration for 27 was and what the conditions are in your region and nationally that gave you the inspiration for writing 27.
Cool. Hi, I'm Jordan. I'm in New Orleans, and I'll give some background a little bit on what why we put this together. So this resolution is a resolution that the Growth and Development Committee Steering Committee sort of drafted collectively. So, you know, we have a body of about 17 people, and a group of us put it together as GDC. To basically direct the work of GDC in the future. So for folks that aren't familiar, GDC is basically like sort of like the internal organizing body of the national organization, similar to how your chapter might have like a membership coordinator and like a mobilizers team, like that sort of thing. We do these things nationally. So we have a number of standing committees, recruitment, retention, mentorship, training, and surveys is also in there too. And some of the major things that we focus on so far are things like centralizing and standardizing trainings, really focusing on things that are getting chapters to dig into structural work, right, in their communities, in their workplaces, to do more intentional organizing. So that's things like we've had a strategic campaigns series that's really been digging into how to develop a strategic campaign. We've had a kind of jumpstarting your chapter series, which is focused on developing new organizers. A lot of this is going to be in areas where we don't have chapters, which are primarily rural, more often in the South, which again is going to prioritize people of color just primarily through organizing new spaces. And we have a creation of an at-large program. So we've gathered all the at-large people into an online workspace, and we have them working on national campaigns and connecting with each other to build capacity and start new chapters. And then in addition to that, we had a 100K drive where we kind of recruited, we asked members to recruit basically. Jorge, do you want to talk a sec about the just meat of the resolution a bit?
Yeah, of course. So a lot of the resolution, and thank you, Jordan, and quick introduction, Jorge Maldonado, he, him. I am in the North New Jersey DSA chapter, and I'm a chair of our training subcommittee. A lot of what this resolution is highlighting a lot of that work that Jordan just went into, but then expanding on it and developing. So what I'm going to highlight is just some of the elements of this resolution that really emphasize how not only do we want to strengthen the work that's been going on, but to be more intentional, to have more follow-up, and to prioritize how we're building a multiracial organization. So just one element that we have very clear and then that's in our structure now is that the GDC will mentor chapters to select and prioritize issue campaigns that establish a pole of socialist, anti-racist politics of solidarity, not based in race essentialism or separatism, and have greater material impact and salience for BIPOC sections of the working class. So this is something structurally we want to start prioritizing to not just train people how to run strategic campaigns, but to also be able to identify campaigns that are deeply, widely felt around anti-racist politics, and that folks have the ability to recognize that and then bring in folks into that work. We also have in that language as well, just kind of covering some of the key sectors of it, right, is making sure that the GDC mentors and train chapters to organize their members as workers and tenants. In particular, the GDC will help equip chapters to conduct strike solidarity, organize the unorganized, join strategic industries, and build neighborhood and tenant organizations. Part of what we really want to do in this work, and I think to answer a question that was a little bit earlier, like where are we right now in terms of multiracial organizing, is that a lot of the work that's grown our organization have in many ways, right, the strategic work that we've done as a national organization, a lot of it's been forces outside, right? It's been major elections of democratic social, it's been the movement for Black lives. So we're seeing now, like, how do we deepen this, right? How are we intentional about this? And, it's going outside into our workplaces and into our homes, right? Organizing apartments, building tenants union, organizing within our unions that we exist, and bringing in where there is greater solidarity and spaces for people to coordinate. And I think the final part that, again, there's a lot to the resolution, but something we really want to emphasize that's more specific to how we're going to build multiracial organizing is to have the GDC integrate YDSA and the recruitment of young people generally into the above industries. Also, YDSA will work with YDSA leadership to build a particular strategy directed towards young people, and especially folks that prioritizes youth recruitment in HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, community colleges, trade schools, high schools, and other sites and institutions with potential for youth recruitment. So those are, I think a lot of the work that we want to do is to be able to try to really give people the skills, not to develop their chapters and to have people feel confident in being intentional about campaigns that are going to be around this type of work, but also to organize people where they're at, but also to organize strategically where folks are involved, and that we can bring into people an organization that is more representative of the broader working class, of course, and that is explicitly around prioritizing anti-racist organizing as well. So I think that's, our work is, we've done a lot already. We want to expand on that, but we also really want to fine tune that and have a lot more explicit follow-up of people, intentional recruitment and development of leaders that build on this work.
All right, thank you, authors of number 27. I do want to give a little bit of time to the authors of number 31. I want to pose the same question to authors of 31, and then I have a mini follow-up question to y'all. So go ahead, authors of 31, if you want to take the floor.
Sure, I'll just motivate analysis. Good. So I'm going to motivate the analysis, and then Mikiko will jump in to talk about some of the concrete steps we're going to take for this resolution that we're hoping to do. So just the big analysis of this resolution is, look, we believe that, we should be, if our goal is to win socialism in the United States and abroad, DSA basically has to do two things. One, reflect a multiracial working class, and two, win demands for that class with that class. So we see it not just something that's morally necessary, but strategically necessary. The working class drives political change. That's part of our theory of change. But the working class, if you look at it, is 50 to 60% people of color, given various estimations. And we want our organization to reflect that, right? And so how do we do that? So the resolution starts with an analysis of what we shouldn't do. So, you know, part of what we shouldn't do, we've seen doesn't really work. One, we shouldn't pretend that race doesn't exist. We shouldn't pretend that our cities and workplaces aren't segregated by race. We can't pretend that racial capitalism crucially, you know, we have to realize that racial capitalism crucially depends on exploiting people of color through not just workplace exploitation, but also policing, prison, and colonialism. Like, that's a very important part of the analysis. We can't ignore white supremacy and white nationalism and the resurgence of that within the country. And finally, we can't ignore racism, whether intentional or unintentional, within our own organizing spaces. So, you know, sometimes people try to be race neutral, so they simply, you know, don't want to see race. We don't think that's going to work. But then also some people have this attitude that, you know, race and class are somehow in competition, and so we shouldn't think about race for that reason. Again, we want to avoid that mentality as well. So on the one hand, you know, we don't want to be race neutral or be what's called class reductionist. On the other hand, we can't pretend that race is the only thing that exists. We can't pretend that Black and brown organizers all have the same politics, that we all have good politics, that we're all great organizers, that you should listen to each one of us, you know, no matter what, right? And having this kind of racial essentialism where you put everything onto people of color, where you expect all Black organizers to represent all working class Black people or all Black socialists, right? That's also going to lead to trouble. That's going to lead to tokenism. That's going to lead to POC organizers not being developed, right? So we want to avoid kind of racial essentialism, putting all of this work on people of color. And that's part of the reason why in this resolution, we think that Afro-socialist and socialist color caucus is very important, but we can't put all of the responsibility of this onto them, right? We want to avoid this idea that multiracial organizing is really just people of color organizing independently or by themselves, right? I think it's important to have these independent spaces for people of color, right? I think that's important. But, you know, at the end of the day, we do think, okay, multiracial organizing is the thing that we want to provide. So we want to, the reason why it's called multiracial organizing resolution is that we think that's the solution. We think the way forward, instead of class reductionism or race neutrality on the one hand, and racial essentialism, or as Jorge mentioned, racial separatism sometimes on the other hand, avoiding both of those approaches and taking an approach rooted in organizing and multiracial solidarity. So I'll just be very brief and then let Mikiko get a chance to say more about this, about the concrete parts of it. But basically the resolution has two parts. We think multiracial organizing has two parts. One is internal and the other one is external. So the internal is strengthening our internal structures and making sure that we're intentional about recruiting and supporting Black and brown organizers. Making sure DSA is a place that people of color feel welcome, right, to come into, right? It's like, it's important, right, to have these campaigns. So that's the external component of it. But if people are coming in just to leave, like, just go right out, then that's a problem, right? So that's the retention component. Then there's, of course, the external campaigns. So winning campaigns that win demands for the multiracial working class. There are different kinds of campaigns. You know, some are kind of strongly impact communities of color, like voting rights, reparations, immigration rights, internationalism. But in a way, every issue is a racial justice issue, right? You know, healthcare is a racial justice issue. Labor is a racial justice issue. Eco-socialism, climate change. We just have to be clear about applying that lens within these broader issues and making sure the way in which it differentially affects people of color, differentially dispossesses them. Dispossesses them. We have to make sure we're clear about how that works for each of these different issues. So I'm just going to, you know, Resolution 31, making DSA a multiracial, anti-racist organization, really outlines our vision for multiracial organizing. And I'm going to let Mikiko talk to you more about that in a second. I just want to give one last bit of context, which is Resolution 31 is the successor of a previous, well, in a way, it's a successor of a previous resolution that I wrote, and I'll post in the chat a little bit later. So it's a resolution that was about prioritizing POC recruitment, retention, and leadership development. It was passed in February's NPC meeting. And so, you know, Jordan and I and other people, Mikiko, a lot of us have been working on this resolution. A report's going to be available to members. Some of this work has been done through the GDC already. So, you know, that's how that's been executed. To motivate why we're looking for a broader committee called the Multiracial Organizing Committee, We found in our conversations with chapters across the country about multiracial organizing and the challenges they have, we've just found that to really comprehensively transform the organization, we're going to need a separate committee that can work with the GDC, but it's going to have to be, we need a clear recognition that multiracial organizing is going to be a priority with staff, NPC members, budget-wise, right? So that's some of the context. So I just want to make it clear that this resolution was put together, coming out of another resolution and also in conversation with lots of people from different tendencies, right? Because this is supposed to be more of a consensus resolution. So I'm going to let Mikiko talk about some of the specifics.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, and just really affirming all of that context is really important as we go into the next 2 years of our organizing, and we're going to see the crises mount and get higher under the weight of capitalism and the kind of disproportionate impact on communities of color. DSA really is going to have to make a choice and how we focus our efforts, because even though we're almost 95,000 strong, it's going to take a lot more of us to survive the onslaught that we're facing. And in my firm belief, we need leadership and organizers of color to be, forefront in our organizing work. One of the first resolves is around this multiracial organizing committee, which we feel really strongly has to be rooted at national leadership levels. So again, to this point of we don't want to separate. You can't have a separate diversity committee, like largely determined, by people of color who are expected to do all the work. This has to come from national leadership levels, and the NPC has to steer and drive this. Why is it not the entire NPC? I think is because that is a lot of people, and I think it is important for us to have people who can focus on this. But I also think it's important to call out, the demographics we encourage it to not be an entire body entirely people of color either, right? This is also white people's responsibility. And so how do we do multiracial organizing? Well, we should probably start with multiracial organizers. And so that is just something to name why that body is described the way it is within the first part of the resolution, and why we were really intentional about that. The second parts are like setting baselines, right? To this point of how can we tell that we aren't representative if we haven't done the research and understanding and assessment of our own organization. Anecdotally, you can head into many DSA meetings and tell, right? You can for the most part, of the stories I've heard, especially if you're not in urban areas, but it's even more surprising and concerning if you're in urban areas, more demographically representative populations. Walking into a DSA meeting is still largely white, right? And so we need to understand how white. We need to understand, what are people of color in the chapters like we are here, right? We don't want to commit erasure. As I think April pointed out earlier, we are doing, and Alyssa as well, like we want to commit to this organization, but we have to know what we're trying to rectify here. And so data collection and analysis is a really important part of this. And that also, takes time and resources and people. And then I think, again, some of the next resolves talk about responsibility, right? We're going to form this committee, but it's not this committee's responsibility to turn DSA into a multiracial organization. It is DSA's responsibility to turn DSA into a multiracial organization, and the committee will help set plans, give strategic benchmarks and strategy and tactics in order to do this, but really just kind of want to emphasize this is not here to set a top-down hierarchical model of like you have to do this work because we this committee say it. We're saying we're going to have some people thinking in a very focused way about this work, but in the end, it is up to our chapters and our membership to really carry out this work. So again, really want to emphasize this is not about telling people what to do. This is about collectively committing to making DSA a multiracial and anti-racist organization. And then some of the other, I think, more concrete resources to put in and hopefully to get out is training, and for us all to become the best organizers we can possibly be. I think one distinction where this is from the GDC's training and mentoring resources is that those are accessible to the entirety of the organization. We actually do feel there is a need to emphasize development of leaders of color and organizers of color in DSA as well, right? Because we need these leaders to be the ones is telling us in certain ways around how these communities are impacted, if we're coming from these communities, if we are the people of color within DSA, to be representative spokespeople for the work that could and should be done in DSA as a whole. So, you know, we can certainly want to have opportunities for all members, but want to have a special emphasis in supporting organizers of color to grow their skills and development as organizers to lead the organization, and then also create safer space for them to talk about the challenges. I mean, as we've clearly illuminated, it is not always easy, if ever easy, to be an organizer of color in this organization. And I think there is also space to be cognizant of that and acknowledge that, and to figure out how to really dedicate time and space to grapple with these tensions that have clearly existed in the organization for its entire history, because we cannot dismiss that those tensions are there and very real. And then finally, I'll touch on some of the issues around accountability, and thinking about what does it mean to hold ourselves accountable to this work. If anyone here is on the convention Slack, I know there's been some questions around these raised standards and accountability, the terminology within the resolution. And for me, I think it really is about, how do we want to hold ourselves accountable? Again, I personally don't want it to be a top-down model where this committee says you did something wrong, you didn't do something, here are the punitive measures we're going to carry out because you didn't carry out the work. I think it's really about, what does it mean to hold ourselves accountable to making DSA more representative? And that is, you know, a process that's more about, how do we work in lockstep together to do better, right? To hold chapters accountable here means, oh, it hasn't successfully happened for your chapter yet. Let's now be in conversation and dialogue, creating actual steps that you can do. And this is the work that's actually currently happening that Kevin mentioned out of the February resolution. We're already in conversations with chapters around, what have you done in terms of assessment? What have you done in terms of understanding your neighborhoods or committee and where people of color are or aren't, right? How have you identified campaigns, and have you assessed whether or not those campaigns will speak in real material ways to communities of color if they're not already being led by communities of color? So really just setting baseline, because we unfortunately haven't been able to see organic growth in that way, right? Campaigns naturally happening aren't bringing people of color in droves to DSA. So we have to have starting conversations that really set our foundation to make us able to be more integrated in our thinking. So those are kind of broad highlights of the resolution itself in terms of actual plans within them, should it pass. And I know we have other questions, so I'll pass it back over to April.
Thank you. Actually, I have one more question regarding some of the similarities and differences of the resolution. So I know we've had some discussions about these two resolutions and how they kind of work in tandem. And we can't really have one without the other, and so anybody can take this question. So just very quickly, probably a few minutes, tell me how these resolutions work together, and if you'd like to highlight a couple of the differences of the resolution as well, if you'd like to.
I can hop in briefly to say, I think also being a member of the GDC, there's a lot of work that happens in that committee, again, that I think is very complementary and necessary for the work of something like the Multiracial Organizing Committee to be successful, right? So if you want to think about it as, you need mentors to be trained in the GDC, but then you'll also have a subset of mentors that might be working with organizers of color specifically. And I don't necessarily see those as separate projects, right? They just need to be in constant communication with each other. Again, whereas we have a lot of members, what we don't have is enough members actively engaged in this kind of work, right? The infrastructural level and the training and development level. So really, we're going to need more hands on deck for us to be successful. I think also things like recruitment and retention, like those broad strategies will still come out of the GDC, but should be an always like direct conversation with the Multiracial Organizing Committee to think about, again, what's our messaging around recruitment? How are we retaining organizers of color? And so, it won't be the job of the Multiracial Organizing Committee to set those broad strategy, but should always be in constant alignment and discussion.
Okay. So I think these are really interesting points, and I think what really sets apart some of the strategy that these resolutions are putting forward is the idea of like actually training and going forth and training our comrades on how to like deal with this conflict resolution, actually, and how to deal with other comrades and things like this. I think at the very end of a colored people's history, Cornel West actually in like 88, the very end of it, like basically he gives this theory and he's like, well, what we have to do is just like go out there and start organizing, right, hand in hand, and that will get rid of racism. Okay, well, it's like 2021, and like that didn't fix it. Like, so I think the difference in like these resolution solution is like some sort of training that goes along with that, right? Instead of being like, we'll get out there and organize, and I hope something different happens. I think that's the actual change that might help with the solution. So like, who's gonna do all this great training? And that's gonna be growth and development, right? So I think we have a quick plug on some stuff that's coming up. If somebody wants to jump in and tell us about that before we go to the Q&A, who is our person?
I think that is me right now. So yeah, very quick, very simple plug. We're talking a lot about what the GDC has been doing and what we plan to do, and how if the 31 passes, right, how we want to link that type of work as much as possible. We have a lot of really big goals. It's been a challenge navigating the goals we set forward. It's been really rewarding for how we've been able to succeed. Also very difficult in the ways that we've like run into some obstacles, but like any type of work, we can only go as far as our capacity and folks who want to be involved. So a lot of this work is ongoing. A lot of this work is in development and needs as many eyes and as much participation from folks as possible. So we're talking about how great this work is. We are taking applications all the time for anybody who has experience or wants to get experience on how to think about on a national level, how we are recruiting our members, how we are diversifying, how we are mentoring chapters and leaders, how we are training them, and how we are strengthening our organization as a whole. How are we learning from what its needs are, and how are we putting people into motion? So if you are interested in joining the GDC, any of the subcommittees that we have, you should follow up with this link. I'm going to post it in just a second. I had it earlier. I don't have it now, but if someone else has it. Oh, I have it now. So I'm going to post this link. If anybody's interested, please fill it out. It's also going to give some information about the different types of committees that there are and what they're about. And we'll have someone follow up with folks. We especially encourage people of color to join. And that's going to be that's been a priority for us. And it's been what we try to emphasize in the GDC. So please join that work to both carry on the project that we have now and however it's shaped post-convention. So let me post this on the chat. Yep, there's the link. Feel free to follow up. And if y'all have any questions, I'll also put my information, but also you can reach out to anybody here because I think everybody here is involved in the, all the resolution authors are involved in the GDC. But thank y'all, everybody.
Okay, so the last bit of our call is actually a Q&A section. Before, I would like to do a quick disclaimer. We want to make sure that this is an open space, that we can have an honest conversation about the direction in which DSA is going and discuss some of the problems that we're having within our chapters. We want to make sure not to use any specific names when we're talking about conflict. If you are having a conflict of any kind, you can message privately me or Sanjeev, who is also on this call. We can get you connected with grievance officers where you can discuss those kinds of things. Otherwise, we are going to open up Q&A. You can address your questions about specifically the resolutions to any of our panelists. And then also, if you would like to ask specifically our historians about something historical, you can direct that to some of our historians. This is not an official NPEC position, but this is a question and answer type scenario. The best questions are questions where we can provide an answer and not long meandering sentences in which there is no answer. Those are best for meditation at a later date alone. All right, let's open this up so that we can provide some answers to some questions, and hopefully we can all learn some stuff. And all the panelists are looking at these questions and answers, and in order so that I'm not like a gatekeeper, they are all going to look at those questions and answer them in the order in which they would like. So please type in your questions in the Q&A boxes, please.
I'm happy to jump in with one from Stan around how come we don't have more people of color as regional leaders. I think it's the same question overarchingly, is how come we don't have that many organizers of color generally, right? And Stan, if you wanted to clarify what you meant by regional leaders, feel free to do that in the Q&A. But I mean, I think one consideration for me is thinking about, you know, who has been drawn to leftist formations historically, right? And we know that there have been like really powerful, important leftist formations that are, you know, obviously are comprised of people of color. But I think in this moment in 2021, where we're seeing people come to DSA, where it's through a lot of relational organizing, right? And inviting people we know. And so right now in this moment, without an intervention of just like asking our friends to join, which I'm not saying we should stop doing, ask all your friends to join, is think about, you know, more specifically, what would make our organizing speak to people of color? How do we create wins and the opportunities to win that show that DSA is here in force for representing the full working class of our country and the world? And I think there are like, and you know, my dream is to have, I think I was reading, there's the Facing Race dialogues that is covered in these amazing articles. You know, DSA needs to dig in and deeply and talk about these issues, right? Who is quote unquote organically drawn to the organization right now, and how do we draw other kinds of people into it? And again, what is hindering that at the moment? I think people can see it once you're in the organization and people have faced organizing challenges and interpersonal challenges around race within this organization. There's no denying that. But even before that, like, I think people are wary, right, of you know, how things look, that it matters, right? What an organization looks like matters. And so just being able to genuinely commit to having those dialogues and opportunities for that kind of analysis is a really important step.
So should we just jump in? Sorry. So maybe I would like to answer this question. What are the top 2 to 3 things white comrades can do right now to make DSA more welcoming? First, vote for the resolutions. That's the first thing. I mean, really, you know, the reason why I like this question is because it brings out one thing I want to emphasize is that we gotta, you know, I understand the spirit of this question in terms of what are particular things that white comrades and individuals can do. Although what I think in the end, we have to start thinking about this. This brings me to the question, the issue of we have to start tackling this as a structural problem within the organization and structural problem within the United States, as opposed to, for instance, a kind of personal issue. So one of the things that, you know, I've seen, and I'm sure other people who worked on this might have seen, just talking to people in different chapters, is that one, people don't feel very comfortable having these conversations about making the organization more diverse, or, you know, anything around multiracial organizing, because there's this feeling of personal responsibility. There's a feeling of shame. There's a feeling of, I didn't do the thing right, or I'm racist, or maybe sometimes you might get called racist, right? So there's all of these personal issues, but I think we should frame it as, this is a structural issue. So my suggestion for people trying to figure this out would say, okay, look, instead of thinking about your personal attitudes, they're important, but think about this, you know, look at the community, map the community that you live in, right? Map the community that you live in. What are the racial demographics of that community? What are the industries within that community? And how do those things intersect? What is the racial composition of your membership? What's the history of your area? And start thinking about it through the lens of, what might be some structural barriers. So I'm going to be very quick. I'm sorry, I'll talk a lot. I'll just give one concrete example of this is, talking to chapters. One thing that, we found was that there were cases where the workplaces were segregated. So some cases, you might have teachers, but then the Black teachers work in the public schools and the white teachers work in the private schools. So now you have an organizing problem because it's segregated along, within the same industry. But then there are cases where you might have the very same workplace, which is segregated. So in higher education, I know one college, someone talked about the staff and faculty being white, but then the custodial staff being composed of Black and brown people. And so now you have a concrete organizing problem that's divided along race lines, and thinking about it as, okay, how do we figure that problem out, as opposed to, feeling bad about it or being enveloped by the shame of the fact that, yeah, you do live in a racially segregated neighborhood. And there are reasons for that. So to look into that and start from there. But again, this is a long structural project. I don't think we can give quick tips or tricks that individuals can do. I think what we can do is start that conversation, start thinking about it structurally, and hopefully these resolutions can provide more support in the way of resources along the way.
Cool. I guess since we're just jumping, I saw one that said, so in my area in Birmingham, we have multiple groups that are already fighting for social justice, and these are, bigger groups, and we don't have a lot of DSA members, and I don't see a lot of DSA members at their rallies, protests, marches, events. Similar to the way Kevin framed his response to the other question. I think with these focus on, these calls that we've been having in preparation of this report have kind of highlighted mixed results in terms of coalition building, right? It's important to build relationships, but the recruitment, really, we want to focus on building relationships with people who aren't organized. And so I think I would say in that situation about Birmingham is just thinking about where our members are situated and what organizing opportunities that presents us. The vast majority of our communities, people aren't politicized, don't see themselves as active in a political organization and acting politically. And so our role as socialists is to go out in our communities, ideally structural relationships, right? Tenants, coworkers, things that we share a bond of material conditions, and just agitate to find out what issues resonate with people and build work around that we can bring people in on. And alongside that, building an organization that people see themselves fitting into, both in terms of, what it takes to be involved in the organization, right? Lowering the barrier of entry so that you don't have to feel like you have to be super activisty, 10 hours a week to contribute to DSA, and make the barrier participation much lower, but also focus on things that really resonate with people to bring out people who aren't already organized. I think it's important to build relationships and map sort of who's involved in your community and what organizations are out there. But the meat of recruiting is going to come from sort of structural relationships that are already there, and not necessarily, pulling from membership of already engaged organizations, right? That's one vision that I think both of these resolutions point towards. So hopefully that helps. If no one's talking, I can take another one if no one's talking. So this other one that's in here is, in my town, organizers seem interested in organizing nurses in front of houses, the whitest parts of hospitals and restaurants. How do I get them to realize this is racist strategizing? This brings me to another thing that has come up, and we've talked about this a little bit. Kevin and I and a couple others have been having calls and chapters to build this report. Something that has come up a lot is that a lot of chapters just simply don't talk about these issues. How do I get people to realize, just make this a discussion within the chapter? I mean, especially if you're someone in chapter leadership or, leader on a campaign or a committee or something, a lot of chapters know this is a problem, and a lot of chapters recognize that this is the conditions that they're organizing under, but they're not like having a collective discussion to realize that because of, like Kevin alluded to this a little bit, like shame or not feeling comfortable talking about it. Like, this needs to be a topic of discussion for everyone, and its urgency needs to be felt, but not in a chastising way. We're not bad people because of this. It's structural, as Kevin says, but we have to recognize it and contend with it in order to move past it.
I think related to that question is this question here about tips for discouraged BIPOC organizers who are ready to try again, right, or to commit back to the organization, which I think is incredible. I mean, honestly, as someone who has gone through quite a few ups and downs within the organization since 2016, it's completely understandable. And I think that's actually one thing that I'd really stress on this call is, in the organizing mindset, there's a lot of go, go, go and commit and asking and calling the questions and agitations and things that are really hard, like just as an emotional experience, like, again, not to individualize it, but this is hard. Organizing for socialism is not a walk in the park. It can be joyful and wonderful. And when we win, we're going to survive. So that's really important. But I think really acknowledging that confronting race in the United States is always going to be like as hard as it sounds. And it's all the more reason why we have to do it. So I think, one tip I would give to chapters who are experiencing or members who are experiencing this is, if you know people in your chapter who you have been able to have deep dialogue and build trust with, like, that's really important. Start finding your fellow organizers, right, who you have relationships with. Like, that is actually a core to organizing, is the relationship. If you don't trust anyone in your chapter, that's a real problem, right? And then maybe you can be looking in these outside spaces. One silver lining of the pandemic is there are opportunities to connect to more people outside of your chapter, but in spaces like Afro-Socialist and Socialists of Color Caucus, as an example, there are lots of people talking about this. Find other people who relate to you and just build relationships. But I think another thing to do is ask the question of, why am I committing to DSA? I mean, and again, you might not have an answer. And then maybe, again, not to say that I want anyone to have this, but it might not be the organization if you don't have faith in the tactic strategies or the people in the organization. But I think all of us have to ask the question, why is this organization one that I believe in enough to commit, even though I know parts of it are going to be hard? And then who can I talk to about the concerns I have? And I really do encourage folks to reach out to people to the extent that this call is happening. People who put on this call care about this issue, and all of these authors care about this issue. But really, it is about building relationships and having people you can trust. With this many people, you're not going to be able to have relationships with all of them. But I think it is core. It's been my core to having a good experience in DSA, and really also being able to have the tough conversations. Oh, and just to touch briefly on this, on the anti-racist training question that Jenna has asked, I think it's a really good one. At the moment, we're in the process of developing trainings. There have been, since my time in DSA, a number of trainings established or developed by people in the Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color Caucus. We also have a training around how issues around race can lead to grievance and conflict, that's being developed by our National Harassment Grievance Officers with input from folks on the National Political Education Committee and AfroSoc. And I hope that process continues, because I think something that's really true is that our trainings need to be iterative, right, and responsive, so we can have framework. But my hope for the Multiracial Organizing Committee is that many of the people that we bring on to support the committee would also have a hand in developing the correct trainings. Because as we know, we can't train our way out of racism. We're not here to contribute to the anti-racism industrial complex that the NGOs seem to think is the answer, but we do need trainings. We do need, in our own organization, the ability to talk about this stuff. So, it's not to supplant or say that that's the answer and that's where we're ending, but I think we need to figure out how to create educational resources for our members that help us dig into these issues in ways that are actually meaningful and strategic.
So just to answer a question, I think it's kind of a follow-up on something I mentioned earlier about kind of racial segregation in neighborhoods and workplaces. And one individual was asking about, in their community, organizers are only seem to be interested in organizing nurses in front of house restaurant workers, the widest parts of the hospitals and restaurants. It's a very service industry heavy town, but we also have meatpacking factories that are very not white, very non-white. And how do we get them to realize this is racist strategizing? I mean, I think the way I would frame this would be in terms of, and this is a kind of wider point to bring it back is, there's a lot of unintentional, sometimes intentional, but I think when we aren't strategic about multiracial organizing, what happens is we're going to naturally go towards like the people we're more likely to know. And given this country, right, if you're a white person in this country, the way that, capitalism has worked in this country, it's been a system that, puts a lot of pressure, structural pressure on you to basically have most of your relations being with other white people, right? That's just the structural development of capitalism in the United States. And I think getting people to realize that ultimately this would create, this would be not just a moral error because you're leaving certain people out, but it's going to cause a strategic error because again, you're gonna have situations where, you and your organizers, maybe your chapter, so let's go to the chapter level, right? You could also be a workplace unit where, you or your chapter, you end up being majority white, but you're in a community that has a lot of black organizers, black and brown organizers. And then you have a real serious problem because, again, of both the history of this country and also the current living reality of this country when it comes to, if I see all of the black workers over here, or if I see a bunch of black people over here and they're in conflict with a bunch of white people over here, 99% of the time in this country, right, people are going to think, okay, this is actually a problem. In many cases, it will be a real problem. So I think framing the issue, it might be useful to frame the issue, again, in terms of, okay, what do we want to reproduce here? Because we might end up reproducing something very bad. And also strategically, we're putting ourselves in a very vulnerable position, as well as the fact that, there's a lot of POC workers in this town, in these hospitals, in these restaurants. We really have to be, we really have to do a lot better. And again, I think this is ultimately, though, this is something that I really think you're gonna need some hands-on help with organizers from the Multiracial Organizing Committee or GDC or a combination of that, or also with the DSLC. But these different groups working in concert to give really concrete advice about what to do on the situation.
Hi, I can take a question just to kind of like orient some folks. It was asked in the chat, I think, by Karen about any trainings and development to work in high schools and colleges to introduce concepts of just society and democracy. Yeah, I would just point that towards the section in the GDC section resolution 27, that part of what we want to do is to be able to integrate YDSA in recruitment of young folk to be involved in the work of everything that we've mentioned so far. Just to kind of give some context about where we are structurally, I think YDSA has been doing their own campaigns. And I think we've tried in some ways to bring folks from YDSA into the GDC, but there hasn't been that explicit kind of link. And we really want to emphasize that going forward. So really drawing on what we've been talking about so far, right? Having this intentionality, having this kind of approach, but being very specific around YDSA campaigns and developing campaigns there that are deeply widely felt, that resonate, and that are targeted specifically towards universities that are more predominantly POC. So I just want to highlight that we don't have currently that systemic kind of structural approach but it's part of what the resolution would want us to collaborate more deeply with YDSA. And just to, I guess, because it's been a question that everybody's been asking, we're responding to about the question about what happens when your chapter is organizing an industry that's predominantly white. As you know, I feel a need to respond directly because also as a nurse organizer, right? I think it's different, right? Like I represent nurses in the Bronx, and there it's a majority of Black and brown nurses. But I think the important point is something that I also think that Jordan said earlier, that these are strategic conversations that people are navigating, and that I think folks should feel empowered to bring this through the channels that exist. Right, because these are conversations that I think are worth like not only help address the issue, but help develop people's ability to be able to go in contact with that. Right, so making sure that folks feel empowered, and that there is, if someone has a different assessment or folks feel very strong about assessment, folks should be able to bring that forward in the proper channels, because there are different conditions, and if that's the type of organizing isn't, it's not in a place that folks think is strategic the way it might be in other places, right, then that's the conversations, and that there are hopefully mechanisms through which people can do that democratically and transparently.
I'll try to respond to a number of ones that have a similar kind of frame to them. So I see a couple questions that are like about, I see a lot of cases where, maybe this isn't just structural, and maybe there are elements of this that are really focused on the chapter culture and problems internally with chapter culture and interpersonal conflict that like either creates challenging conditions for or people of color organizing in the chapter or something like that. So what I would say that the main meat of what these proposals do in terms of addressing that is this piece about accountability in number 31. I think having this multiracial organizing committee have an element of its work that's focused on coordinating with committees and chapters to have an accountability process for when we aren't sort of executing the multiracial organizing that we want to see in the organization, having a space where we're working with chapters to address these challenges, I think is something that doesn't exist formally in DSA currently in a way that's more about the politics and the challenges with the chapter internally. And the other thing I would point to is that what the piece of the kind of this report that is going to get put out is really going to advocate for making these discussions within the chapter. In my experience, and a lot of times when I've seen this sort of conflicts come up, and I've definitely seen these bubbling up throughout the organization, a lot of times it comes up because these issues aren't talked about, and then conflict bubbles up and continues to bubble up until it reaches a boiling point. And so making this an issue that the whole organization is thinking about, and chapters are actually spending time in a group collectively sort of dissecting these challenges, is something that we're just not doing, like in general. And challenging everyone to do that, I think, is something that we're going to be, asking people to do at convention and going into the second half of the year. Hopefully that is a response to those. It's a very difficult problem that we all need to work on.
Could I just follow up on a little bit what Jordan was mentioning? Because I also see there's some people asking about the clarification, what it mean by structure and structural. So I really want to be clear about that. So, by structural, I'm not one, I don't want to I don't want to ignore the very real interpersonal problems that we have in our spaces. So I don't want to pretend that that doesn't exist and that's not a factor. I think there are two elements to structural kind of racism or oppression in this context, or the lack of multiracial organizing. One, there are the external conditions outside of the chapter that I was talking about in terms of what your communities are structured like, what does the community look like, right? But then also there is a question of the internal structure leading to people of color not wanting necessarily to be in your space, or working class people of color, right? Not necessarily wanting to be in your DSA chapters. So in this context, right, if you have a chapter, if you set this expectation that, for instance, you shouldn't talk about race, right, I would consider that within your chapter a structural issue, right? So structural issues to me is both, outside, in terms of, what does this country look like? What's this neighborhood segregated in this way? But it's also, what is the internal functioning in the chapter, right? What does that look like? And are there ways that the internal structure of your chapter leads to people of color either coming in and leaving, leads to them just not coming in, right? Really taking a deep dive into you know, how your bylaws work, what a regular meeting is like, how you recruit. Those are all structural questions to me. So I did want to be clear about that and not make this seem like, you know, there isn't some things that our chapters can do. There are things that we can do as chapters and we can do as individuals.
I think speaking a little bit more to that, and then to this question around the distinction between how DSA might address anti-racism versus, say, something that's happening in like a boardroom of a Fortune 500 company right now, because everyone's on board to be anti-racist in this moment, but are they really? I think as socialists, you know, it's our responsibility to apply class analysis to this work, right? And it's, again, to the structural issue, these are not, racism cannot be fixed by individuals alone, right? It's the collective effort of our people to eradicate racism and to be genuinely representative of all people's needs. But I think part of where we get mired is like, again, focusing more on the guilt as opposed to the responsibility. And I think, you know, we as socialists, we are suggesting huge foundational, transformational, structural change within our societies. And as such, that's what we talk about in our anti-racist trainings, right? As opposed to what kind of microaggressions did you experience in the hallway today? Like, I think there are certainly there's validity to it, talking about when there are interpersonal grievances within our organization. But I think for the purposes of this conversation and these resolutions, it's how do we, like, as a whole, orient our entire organization to address racism on like wider levels, right? How do we get policy passed? How do we build power to move the people? And it's, you know, there are obviously individual conversations that have to happen in the context of organizing, but when we're talking about it in the framework of training our organizers, I think we need to be helping people to understand a clear analysis of racial capitalism and talking about it as it applies to everyone, as opposed to like individual people within individual interactions, which is what I found having taken a number of anti-racist trainings within, you know, kind of corporate or liberal NGO contexts.
Hey folks, so it's like 4 minutes till, so I'm doing this a little bit early, but I see that our numbers are starting to drop. So I am going to leave it open so that if people want to continue to ask questions, and if our panelists and guests want to continue to answer those questions, you can do that. But I did want to take a second to thank everyone for being here and our remaining attendees for taking time out of your schedule to attend this panel and listen a little bit about the history of DSA and where we're going in the future. And the answer at the end of the day is, will Resolution 27 and 31 fix everything in DSA? We don't know, but we do know that it's taking some proactive steps in order to challenge some of these structural issues that are happening in DSA to combat that racism. And so I hope that you've learned something about how these two resolutions work. I hope that you've learned something about the history of DSA and how DSA works, about some of the issues that are going on. And I hope that you have some food for thought. And I hope you enjoyed this panel. So thank you for sharing a few hours, moments, minutes of your Sunday with us. This panel was put on by the National Political Education Committee, and my name is April. If you do have any questions and our panelists are hanging around, you can continue to do that. Just wanted to thank everyone here and say goodbye to anybody who does have to drop off.
April, can I just make a quick plug? We do have our upcoming telethon to kick off our annual convention on July 30th. So in order for this work to happen, whether through these resolutions or otherwise, we need to support the organization and all of our members. So I'm just going to drop a link to that event if you can make it, and tell folks it's open to everyone. You don't have to be a delegate to convention to attend. Please support the telethon and the work of the organization.
All right. Back to the questions.
Maybe I'll answer one question and then I'll probably have to go soon. Oh, Mikiko, do you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to answer Nick's question, but if you had one, then you have to go.
You can go ahead and I can go after you.
Oh, the question on kind of action steps, what can you take away from this conversation? I believe, so the work of the BIPOC resolution conversations that we've been having that Kevin mentioned, I believe all chapter leaders received an opportunity to sign up for a conversation with any of the number of us working on that resolution, the one that passed in February. And that's a really great, I've had some really incredible conversations with chapter leaders around the country, just around some of these very topics. And so that's a really great place to start, is just having this interview process and signing up for that. Kevin, I don't know if we have a link to that.
I just put it in chat.
Great. So you can sign up for a conversation just to kind of jumpstart, the dialogue where you're based.
Sure. I was just going to quickly answer a question about political education. What role does political education play? As a queer person, DSA, I found our queer caucuses are more focused on creating safe spaces and pushing for change within DSA. It's something similar happening from the other identity caucuses. So I can't speak to what's going on like in a lot of different caucuses. I can just say in terms of these resolutions, we really want to, part of this issue is political education, right? So I think we really, part of the stumbling block is that we haven't had a clear analysis of, for instance, racial capitalism, a clear analysis of, how are we actually thinking about this? And then also, having the space to have disagreements, right, about the exact details of how that might go, right? I think, the fact that we don't have that discussion isn't necessarily promoted. And then we also don't have, again, like, take a national stance on, hey, we think of race, like, for instance, one thing that could happen as a consequence of this resolution would be, the national stance being, look, we disagree about some details, but we broadly agree that there's this thing called racial capitalism. And in racial capitalism, race and class work in, some general way where, for instance, Black people are going to be more likely to be dispossessed via policing mechanism, arbitrary fines of the kind we see in Ferguson and so on and so forth. But it's still part of capitalism. So, that would just be an example of, the national organization really trying to, make sure they're working with the National Political Education Committee, for instance, to make sure these materials are kind of streamlined, they're passed on to chapters, and that chapters have a space for discussion, the space to discuss this stuff. Because at the end of the day, I do think the political education is an important component, because if you don't, think that any of this stuff is a thing, well, then you're not going to actually try to change anything, right? You're not going to see anything wrong with a chapter that, for instance, would be 90% white in a 70% Black area or something like that, right? So political education is an actual necessary component.
I'll just jump right onto that since I want to reply to that question. I think everything Kevin said is correct, and I'll just highlight the specific kind of section that I think highlights that in Resolution 27, that the GDC, in coordination with the National Political Education Committee and DSA national committees and campaigns, will develop a national arc of participation for new DSA members, from orientation to political education, organizer trainings, and campaigns. I think, part of when we talk about structure, right, it's having these kind of priorities laid out, and we're ensuring that this is happening to all new members, whether they're in a chapter that currently exists or it's at large members, or ensuring that chapters have all of this in place, right? A place to welcome new people, know how to welcome people effectively, to create spaces where people are learning how to discuss ideas, and also know how to make sure that the ideas that we're choosing to discuss are deeply and widely felt by the communities that we're organizing in. And then second, to be able to know how to organize from there, right? To take the steps on what it means to be able to build something and to build something collectively, but to also be really prioritized, right? Issues that are specific to people of color, issues specific to the organizing context that people are in. These are, this is like an arc that we want to establish that any chapter should have, and that's part of what the training subcommittee has been trying to do, to ensure that every chapter has that, or if you're not in a chapter or you're just a new member, you have that space and opportunity to kind of have those elements of a chapter or elements of an organization that can help, bring these issues into light and to have those conversations for everybody else.
So going off of that, one thing that we discussed a few years ago with Bill Fletcher Jr., we're talking about like what can DSA do to be more diverse. And he told us, we don't really have a line on what racism is. We don't have any real theoretical grounding outside of a Cornell West article in the 80s about what racism is, how it affects people today, what it means for the working class, and what its historical roots are. And so I think that going forward, developing a theory of racism and then being able to tie that internationally to historical struggles against colonialism and contemporary struggles against neocolonialism to create a sort of like global viewpoint that we can introduce people to and be like, this is what we think is happening, I think is critical for the future of the organization.
I think that's a great point to move us onward, because I think that is the ongoing work too, right? Is both to do the external organizing campaign project work, but also the internal assessment, analysis, history, understanding ourselves and the movement and the moment. And so all of these things, again, why we need more bodies, because it's a lot of work. And so we really encourage folks to stay involved. I hope you'll pass both of these resolutions. And even if not, I'm committing to doing this work in DSA for the long haul. So I really hope everyone who's engaged in this call will stay engaged in the work as well. Thanks so much for having us, everyone. Thank you, April, for excellent facilitation.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Second, what Mikiko said, and vote for our resolution. That is the thing, and also understand that what's good about these resolutions. I feel good about them because there's a concrete record of activity that's been behind both of these resolutions, and I think that just makes it so much more. I don't know, you feel more empowered because I think we have a much better chance of actually fulfilling the mandate of these various resolutions. So please, if you have delegates, please tell them to vote for both of these resolutions, and solidarity.